Chapter 44 of East Lynne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. East Lynne by Mrs. Henry Wood. Chapter 44. Lord Vane dating forward. To the burial of William Carlyle came Lord Mount Severn and his son. Wilson had been right in her surmises as to the resting place. The Carlyle vault was opened for him, and an order went forth to the sculptor for an inscription to be added to their marble tablet in the church. William Vane Carlyle, eldest son of Archibald Carlyle of East Lynne. Amongst those who attended the funeral as mourners went one more notable in the eyes of the gazers than the rest, Richard Hare the younger. Lady Isabel was ill in mind, and ominously ill in body. She kept her room, and Joyce attended on her. The household set down Madame's illness to the fatigue of having attended upon Master William. It was not thought of seriously by anyone, especially as she declined to see a doctor. All her thoughts now were directed to the getting away from East Lynne, for it would never do to remain there to die, and she knew that death was on his way to her, and that no human power or skill, not all the faculty combined, would turn him back again. The excessive dread of detection was not upon her as it had been formerly. I mean, she did not dread the consequences so much if detection came. In nearing the grave, all fears and hopes of whatever nature relating to this world lose their force, and fears or hopes regarding the next world take their place. Our petty feelings here are lost in the greater. In returning to East Lynne, Lady Isabel had entered upon a daring act, and she found in the working that neither strength nor spirit was equal to it. Human passions and tempers were brought with us into this world, and they can only quit us when we bid it farewell, to enter upon immortality in the next. When Lady Isabel was Mr. Carlyle's wife, she had never wholly loved him. The very utmost homage that esteem, admiration, affection could give was his. But that mysterious passion called by the name of love, and which, as I truly and heartily believe, cannot, in its refined etherealism, be known to many of us, had not been given to him. It was now, from the very night she came back to East Lynne, her love for Mr. Carlyle had burst forth with an intensity never before felt. It had been smouldering almost ever since she quitted him. Reprehensible, groans a moralist. Very. Everybody knows that, as Afy would say. But her heart, you see, had not done with human passions, and they work ill. And contrariness, let the word stand, critic, if you please, and precisely everything they should not. I shall get in for it, I fear, if I attempt to defend her, but it was not exactly the same thing, as though she suffered herself to fall in love with somebody else's husband. Nobody would defend that. We have not turned Mormons yet, and the world does not walk upon its head. But this was a peculiar case. She, poor thing, almost regarded Mr. Carlyle as her husband. The bent of her thoughts was only too much inclined to this. The evil human heart again. Many and many a time did she wake up from a reverie and strive to drive this mistaken view of things away from her, taking shame to herself. 10 minutes afterward she would catch her brain revealing in the same rebellious vision. Mr. Carlyle's love was not hers now. It was Barbara's. Mr. Carlyle did not belong to her. He belonged to his wife. It was not only that he was not hers, he was another's. You may, therefore, if you have the pleasure of being experienced in this sort of thing, guess a little of what her inward life was. Had there been no Barbara in the case, she might have lived and borne it. As it was, it had killed her before her time. That and the remorse together. There had been other things too. The reappearance of Francis Levison at West Lynne, in fresh contact, as may be said, with herself had struck terror to her heart, and the dark charge brought against him augmented awfully her remorse. Then the sharp lances perpetually thrust upon her memory, the Lady Isabel's memory, from all sides, were full of cruel stings, unintentionally though they were hurled. And there was the hourly chance of discovery, and the never-ceasing battle with her conscience, for being at East Lynne at all. No wonder that the cords of life were snapping. The wonder would have been had they remained whole. She brought it upon herself. She ought not to have come back to East Lynne. Groans our moralist again. Didn't I say so? Of course she ought not. Neither ought she to have suffered her thoughts to stray in the manner they did. Towards Mr. Carlyle she ought not. but she did. If we all did just what we ought, this lower proverb touching fruit defend you would go out as a dead letter. She was nearer to death than she imagined. She knew, judging by her declining strength and her inner feelings, that it could not be far off, but she did not deem it was coming so very soon. Her mother had died in a similar way. Some said of consumption. Dr. Martin did, you may remember. Some said of waste. The Earl, her husband, said a broken heart. You heard him say so to Mr. Carlyle in the first chapter of this history. The Earl was the one who might be supposed to know best. Whatever may have been Lady Mount Severn's malady, she, to give you the phrase that was in people's mouths all the time, went out like the snuff of a candle. It was now the turn of Lady Isabel. She had no more decided disorder than the Countess had had, yet death had marked her. She felt that it had, and in its reproach she dreaded not, as she once had done, the consequences that must ensue did discovery come, which brings us back to the point whence ensued this long digression. I dare say you are chaffing at it, but it is not often I trouble you with one. But she would not willingly let discovery come, neither had she the least intention of remaining at East Lynne to die. Where she should take refuge was quite a secondary consideration. Only let her get smoothly and plausibly away. Joyce, in her dread, was forever urging it. Of course the preliminary step was to arrange matters with Mrs. Carlyle, and in the afternoon of the day following the funeral, Lady Isabel proceeded to her dressing-room, and craved an interview. Mr. Carlyle quitted the room as she entered it. Barbara, fatigued with the recent drive, was lying on the sofa. She would scarcely take the notice. "We shall be so sorry to lose you, Madame Vine. You are all we could wish for Lucy, and Mr. Carlyle feels truly grateful for your love and attention to his poor boy. To leave you will give me pain also," Madame Vine answered, in a subdued tone. "Pain? Ay, Mrs. Carlyle little guessed at its extent. All she cared for on earth she should leave behind her at East Lynne." "Indeed you must not leave," resumed Barbara. "It would be unjust to allow you to do so. You have made yourself ill, waiting upon poor William, and you must stay here and take a holiday until you are cured. You will soon get well, if you will only suffer yourself to be properly waited on and taken care of." "You are very considerate. Pray do not think me insensible if I decline. I believe my strength is beyond getting up, that I shall ever be able to teach again." "Oh, nonsense," said Barbara, in her quick way. "We are all given to fancy the worst when we are ill. I was feeling terribly weak only a few minutes ago, and said something of the same sort to Archibald. He talked and soothed me out of it. I wish you had your dear husband living, Madame Vine, to support you and love you, as I have him." A tinge of scarlet streaked Madame Vine's pale face, and she laid her hand upon her beating heart. "How could you think of leaving? We should be glad to help re-establish your health in any case, but it is only fair to do it now. I felt sure, by the news brought to me when I was ill, that your attention upon William was overtasking your strength." "It is not the attendance upon William that has brought me into this state," was the quick answer. "I must leave. I have well considered it over." "Would you like to go to the seaside?" exclaimed Barbara with sudden energy. "I am going there on Monday next. Mr. Carlyle insists upon it that I try a little change. I intended only to take my baby, but we can make different arrangements, and take you and Lucy. It might do you good, Madame Vine." She shook her head. "No, it would make me worse. All that I want is perfect quiet. I must beg you to understand that I shall leave. And I should be glad if you could allow the customary notice to be dispensed with, so that I may be at liberty to depart within a few days." "Look here, then," said Barbara, after a pause of consideration. "You remain at East Lynne until my return, which will be in a fortnight. Mr. Carlyle cannot stay with me, so I know I shall be tired in less time than that. I do not want you to remain to teach, you know, Madame Vine. I do not wish you to do a single thing. Lucy shall have a holiday, and Mr. Kane can come up for her music. Only I could not be content to leave her, unless under your surveillance. She is getting of an age now not to be consigned to servants, not to Joyce. Upon my return, if you still wish to leave, you shall then be at liberty to do so. What do you say?" Madame Vine said yes, said it eagerly, to have another fortnight with her children. Lucy and Archibald was very like a reprieve, and she embraced it, although she knew, as I have said, that grim death was on his way. She did not think he had drawn so near the end of his journey. Her thoughts went back to the time when she had been ordered to the seaside after an illness. It had been a marvel, if they had not. She remembered how he, her husband, had urged the change upon her, how he had taken her, travelling carefully, how tenderly anxious he had been in the arrangements for her comfort, when settling her in the lodgings, how, when he came again to see her, he had met her with his passionate fondness, thanking God for the visible improvements in her looks, that one injunction which she had called him back to give him, as he was departing for the boat, was bitterly present to her now. Do not get making love to Barbara Hare. All this care and love and tenderness belonged now of right to Barbara, and were given to her. But now Barbara, although she pressed Madame Vine to remain at East Lynne, and indeed would have been glad that she should do so, did not take her refusal at heart. Barbara could not fail to perceive that she was a thoroughly refined gentlewoman, far superior to the generality of governesses, that she was truly fond of Lucy, and most anxious for her welfare in every way. Barbara also saw, for Lucy's sake, therefore, she would be grieved to part with Madame Vine, and would raise her salary to anything in reason, if she would but stay. But on her own score, Barbara had as soon as Madame Vine went as not, for in her heart of hearts she had never liked her. She could not have told why. Was it instinct? Very probably. The birds of the air, the beasts of the field, the fishes of the sea, have their instincts, and so does man have his. Perhaps it was the unaccountable resemblance that Madame Vine bore to Lady Isabel, a strange likeness, Barbara often thought, but whether it lay in the face, the voice, or the manner, she could not decide. A suspicion of the truth did not cross her mind. How should it? And she never spoke of it. Had the resemblance been to anyone but Lady Isabel, she would have talked of it freely. Or it may have been that there was now and then a tone in Madame Vine's voice that grated on her ear, a wrung impatient tone, wanting in respect, savouring of hauteur, which Barbara did not understand, and did not like. However it may have been, certain it is that Mrs. Carlyle would not shed tears after the governess. Only for Lucy's sake did she regret parting with her. These different resemblances and reflections were separately passing through the minds of the two ladies, when their conference was over. Madame Vine at length rose from her chair to depart. "Would you mind holding my baby for 1 minute?" cried Barbara. Madame Vine quite started. "The baby there," she uttered. Barbara laughed. "It is lying by my side, under the shawl, quiet little sleeping thing." Madame Vine advanced, and took the sleeping baby. How could she refuse? She had never had it in her arms before. She had in fact scarcely seen it. One visit of ceremony she had paid to Mrs. Carlyle, as in politeness bound, a day or two after the young lady's arrival, and had been showed a little face, nearly covered with lace, in a cradle. "Thank you. I can get up now. I might have half smothered it, had I attempted before," continued Barbara, still laughing. "I have been here long enough, and am quite rested. Talking about smothering children, what accounts have we in the Register General's weekly returns of health? So many children overlaid in bed, so many children suffocated in bed. 1 week there were nearly 20, and often there are as many as 8 or 10. Mr. Carlyle says he knows they are smothered on purpose." "Oh, Mrs. Carlyle!" I exclaimed just as you do, when he said it, and laid my hand over his lips. He laughed, and he told me I did not know half the wickedness of the world. "Thank you," again repeated Mrs. Carlyle, taking her child from Lady Isabel. "Is she not a pretty baby? Do you like the name Anne?" "It is a simple name," replied Lady Isabel, "and simple names are always the most attractive." That is just what Archibald thinks, but he wanted his child to be Barbara. I would not have had it Barbara for the world. I remember his once saying, a long, long while ago, that he did not like elaborate names. They were mouthfuls, and he instanced mine and his sister's and his own. I recalled his words to him, and he said he may not have liked the name of Barbara then, but he loved it now. So we entered into a compromise. Miss Baby was named Anne Barbara. with an understanding that the first name is to be for use, and the last for the registers." "It is not christened," said Lady Isabel, "only baptized. We should have had it christened before now, but for William's death. Not that we give christening dinners, but I waited for the trial at Lynneborough to be over, that my dear brother Richard might stand to the child." "Mr. Carlyle does not like christenings made into festivals," Lady Isabel dreamily observed, her thoughts buried in the past. "How do you know that?" exclaimed Barbara, opening her eyes, and poor Madame Vine, her pale face flushing, had to stammer forth some confused words that she had heard so somewhere. "It is quite true," said Barbara. "He has never given a christening dinner for any of his children, and gets out of attending, if invited to one. He cannot understand the analogy between a solemn religious rite and the meeting together afterward to eat and drink, and make merry, according to the fashion of this world." As Lady Isabel quitted the room, young Vane was careering through the corridor, throwing his head in all directions, and calling out, "Lucy, I want Lucy." "What do you want with her?" asked Madame Vine. "Il m'est impossible de vous l'aimer, madame," responded he, being, for an Eton boy, wonderfully up in French. He was rather given to show it off when he got the chance. He did not owe thanks for it to Eton. Lady Mount Severn had taken better care than that. Better care? What could she want? There was one whole real live French tutor, and he was an Englishman. For the 800 boys, very unreasonable of her ladyship to disparage that ample provision. "Lucy cannot come to you just now. She is practising. Mais les défauts, les droits demander après elle. Il me ramperait, vous comprenez, madame, cette demoiselle-là." Madame could not forbear a smile. "I wish you would speak English sense instead of French nonsense." "Then the English sense is that I want Lucy, and I must have her. I am going to take her for a drive in the pony carriage, if you must know. She said she'd come, and John's getting it ready." "I could not possibly allow it," said Madame Vine. "You be sure to upset her." "The idea!" he returned indignantly. "As if I should upset Lucy! Why, I'm one of the great whips at Eton. I care for Lucy too much not to drive steadily." "She is to be my wife, you know." "Mais bonne dame." At this juncture, two heads were pushed out from the library, close by, those of the Earl and Mr. Carlyle. Barbara also, attracted by the talking, appeared at the door of her dressing-room. "What's that about a wife?" asked my lord of his son. The blood mantled in the young gentleman's cheek as he turned round and saw who had spoken, but he possessed all the fearlessness of an Eton boy. "I intend Lucy Carlyle to be my wife, papa. I mean in earnest, when we shall both be grown up, if you will approve, and Mr. Carlyle will give her to me." The Earl looked somewhat impassible, Mr. Carlyle amused. "Suppose," said the latter, "we adjourn the discussion to this day 10 years. But that Lucy is so very young a child, I should reprove you seriously, sir," said the Earl. "You have no right to bring Lucy's name into any such absurdity." "I mean it, papa. You'll all see. And I intend to keep out of scrapes, that is, of nasty, dishonorable scrapes, on purpose that Mr. Carlyle shall find no excuse against me. I have made up my mind to be what he is, a man of honor. I am right glad you know about it, sir, and I shall let mamma know it before long." The last sentence tickled the Earl's fancy, and a grim smile passed over his lips. "It will be a war to his knife if you do." "I know that," laughed the Viscount. "But I am getting a better match for mamma in our battles than I used to be." Nobody saw fit to prolong the discussion. Barbara put her veto upon the drive in the pony carriage, unless John sat behind to look after the driver, which Lord Vane still resented as an insult. Madame Vine, when the corridor became empty again, laid her hand upon the boy's arm as he was moving away, and drew him to the window. "In speaking as you do of Lucy Carlyle, do you forget the disgrace reflected on her by the conduct of your mother?" "Her mother is not Lucy. It may prove an impediment, that, with Lord and Lady Mount Severn." "Not with his lordship, and I must do, as you heard me say, battle with my mother, conciliatory battle. You understand, madame.
bringing the enemy to reason. Madame Vine was agitated.
She held her handkerchief to her mouth,
and the boy noticed how her hands trembled.
I have learnt to love Lucy. It has appeared to me in these few months' sojourn with her,
that I have stood to her in light of a mother. William Vane,
she solemnly added, keeping her hold upon him, I shall soon be where earthly distinctions are no more, where sin and sorrow are no more. Should Lucy Carlyle indeed become your wife, in after years,
never cast upon her, by so much as the slightest word of reproach, the sin of Lady Isabel. Lord Vane threw back his head, his honest eyes flashing in their indignant earnestness. What do you take me for? It would be a cruel wrong upon Lucy. She does not deserve it. That unhappy lady's sin was all her own. Let it die with her. Never speak to Lucy of her mother.
The lad dashed his hand across his eyes, for they were filling. I shall speak to her often of her mother, that is,
you know, after she's my wife. I shall tell her how I love Lady Isabel, that there's nobody I ever loved so much in the world but Lucy herself. I cast a reproach to Lucy on the score of her mother, he hotly added. It is through her mother that I love her. You don't understand, madame. Cherish and love her forever, should she become yours, said Lady Isabel, wringing his hand. I ask it you as one who is dying. I will, I promise it. But I say, madame, he continued, dropping his fervent tone, what do you allude to? Are you worse?
Madame Vine did not answer. She glided away without speaking. Later, when she was sitting by twilight in the grey parlour, cold and shivering, and wrapped up in a shawl, though it was hot summer weather, somebody knocked at the door. Come in, cried she apathetically. It was Mr. Carlyle who entered. She rose up, her pulses quickening, her heart thumping against her side. In her wild confusion, she was drawing forward a chair for him. He laid his hand upon it, and motioned her to her own. Mrs. Carlyle tells me that you have been speaking to her of leaving, that you find yourself too much out of health to continue with us. Yes, sir, she faintly replied, having a most imperfect notion of what she did say. What is it that you find to be the matter with you? I think it is chiefly weakness, she stammered. Her face had grown as grey as the walls, a dusky livid sort of hue, not unlike William's had worn the night of his death, and her voice sounded strangely hollow. The voice struck Mr. Carlyle, and awoke his fears. You never can have caught William's complaint in your close attendance upon him? He exclaimed, speaking in the impulse of the moment, as the idea flashed across him. I have heard of such things. I caught it from him, she rejoined, carried away also by impulse. It is more likely that she stopped herself just in time, inherited it from me, had been the destined conclusion in her alarm. She went off volubly, something to the effect that it was no wonder she was ill, unless it was natural to her family. At any rate, you have become ill at East Lynne, in attendance on my children, rejoined Mr. Carlyle decisively, when her voice died away. You must therefore allow me to insist that you allow East Lynne to do what it can toward renovating you. What is your objection to see a doctor? A doctor could do me no good, she faintly answered. Certainly not, so long as you will not consult one. Indeed, sir, doctors could not cure me, nor, as I believe, prolong my life. Mr. Carlyle paused. Are you believing yourself to be in danger? Not in immediate danger, sir, only in so far as that I know I shall not live. And yet you will not see a doctor, Madame Vine. You must be aware that I could not permit such a thing to go on in my house. Dangerous illness and no advice. She could not say to him, my malady is on the mind. It is a breaking heart, and therefore no doctor of physic could serve me. That would never do. She had sat with her hand across her face, between her spectacles and her wrapped-up chin. Had Mr. Carlyle possessed the eyes of Argus, backed by Sam Weller's patent magnifying microscopes of double extra power, he could not have made anything of her features in the broad light of day, but she did not feel so sure of it. There was always an undefined terror of discovery when in his presence, and she wished the interview at an end. I will see Mr. Wainwright, if it will be any satisfaction to you, sir. Madame Vine, I have intruded upon you here to say that you must see him, and should he deem it necessary, Dr. Martin also. "Oh, sir," she rejoined with a curious smile, "Mr. Wainwright will be quite sufficient. There will be no need of another. I will write a note to him to-morrow."
"Spare yourself the trouble. I am going into West Lynne, and will send him up. You will permit me to urge that you spare no pains or care, that you suffer my servants to spare no pains or care, to re-establish your health. Mrs. Carlyle tells me that the question of your leaving remains in abeyance until her return." "Pardon me, sir. The understanding with Mrs. Carlyle was that I should remain here until her return, and should then be at liberty at once to leave."
"Exactly. That is what Mrs. Carlyle said. But I must express a hope
that by that time you may be feeling so much better as to reconsider your decision, and continue with us for my daughter's sake. Madame Vine, I trust it will be so." He rose as he spoke,
and held out his hand. What could she do but rise also, drop hers from her face, and give it him in answer? He retained it, clasping it warmly.
"How should I repay you? How thank you for your love to my poor lost boy?" His earnest, tender eyes were on her blue double spectacles. A sad smile mingled with the sweet expression of his lips
as he bent toward her, lips that had once been hers, a faint exclamation of despair, a vivid glow of hot crimson,
and she caught up her new black silk apron, so deeply bordered with crape, in her disengaged hand, and flung it up to her face. He mistook the sound, mistook the action. "Do not grieve for him. He is at rest. Thank you greatly for your sympathy."
Another wring of her hand, and Mr. Carlyle had quitted the room. She laid her head upon the table, and thought how merciful would be death when she should come. End of chapter 44.
Chapter 45 of East Lynne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. East Lynne by Mrs. Henry Wood. Chapter 45. It won't do, Afy. Mr. Jiffin was in his glory. Mr. Jiffin's house was the same. Both were in apple pie order to receive Miss Afy Halligan, who was in a very short period indeed to be converted to Mrs. Jiffin. Mr. Jiffin had not seen Afy for some days, had not been able to come across her since the trial at Lynneborough. Every evening had he danced attendance at her lodgings, but could not get admitted. "Not at home, not at home," was the invariable answer, though Afy might be sunning herself at the window in his very sight. Mr. Jiffin, throwing off as best he could the temporary disappointment, was in an ecstasy of admiration, for he set it all down to Afy's retiring modesty on the approach of the nuptial day. "And they could try to calumniate her," he indignantly replied. But now, one afternoon, when Mr. Jiffin and his shopman, and his shop and his wares were all set out to the best advantage, and very tempting they looked, as a whole, especially the spiced bacon, Mr. Jiffin, happening to cast his eyes to the opposite side of the street, beheld his beloved sailing by. She was got up in the fashion, a mauve silk dress, with 18 flounces and about 1800 steel buttons that glittered your sight away, a suave jacket worked with gold, a black turban perched on the top of her skull, garnished in front with what court milliners are pleased to term a plume de coq, but which, by its size and height, might have been taken for a cock himself, while a white ostrich feather was carried round and did duty behind, and a spangled hair-net hung down to her waist. Gloriously grand was Afy that day, and if I had but a photographing machine at hand, or whatever may be the scientific name for the thing, you should certainly have been regaled by the sight of her. Joyce would have gone down in a fit had she encountered her by an unhappy chance. Mr. Jiffin, dashing his apron anywhere, tore across. "Oh, it is you," said Afy freezingly, when compelled to acknowledge him. But his offered hand she utterly repudiated. "Really, Mr. Jiffin, I should feel obliged if you would not come out to me in this offensive and public manner." Mr. Jiffin grew cold. "Offensive? Not come out?" gasped he. I do trust I have not been so unfortunate as to offend you, Miss Afy." "Well, you see," said Afy, calling up all her impudence to say what she had made up her mind to say, "I have been considering it well over, Jiffin, and I find that to carry out the marriage will not be for our happiness. I intended to write to inform you of this, but I shall be spared the trouble, as you have come out to me." The perspiration, cold as ice, began to pour off Mr. Jiffin in his agony and horror. You might have wrung every thread he had on. "You don't mean to imply that you give me up, Miss Afy?" he jerked out unevenly. "Well, yes, I do," replied Afy. "It's as good to be plain, and then there can be no misapprehension. I'll shake hands now with you, Jiffin, for the last time, and I'm very sorry that we both made such a mistake." Poor Jiffin looked at her. His gaze would have melted a heart of stone. "Miss Afy, you can't mean it. You'd never sure crush a fellow in this manner, whose whole soul is yours, who trusted you entirely. There's not an earthly thing I would not do to please you. You've been the light of my existence." "Of course," returned Afy, with a lofty and indifferent air, as if to be the light of his existence was only her due. "But it's all done and over. It is not at all the settlement that will suit me. You see, Jiffin, a butter and bacon factory is so very what I have not been accustomed to. And then those aprons, I never could get reconciled to them." "I'll discard the aprons altogether," cried he in a fever. "I'll get a second shopman, and buy a little gig, and do nothing but drive you out. I'll do anything if you will have me still, Miss Afy. I have bought the ring, you know." "Your intentions are very kind," was the distant reply, "but it's a thing impossible. My mind is fully made up. So farewell for good, Jiffin, and I wish you better luck with your next venture." Afy, lifting her capacious dress, for the streets had just been watered, minced off, and Mr. Joe Jiffin, wiping his wet face as he gazed after her, instantly wished that he could be nailed up to one of his pickled pork barrels, and so be out of his misery. "That's done with, thank goodness," soliloquized Afy. "Have him indeed! After what Richard let out on the trial! As if I should look after anybody less than Dick Hare! I shall get him, too. I always knew Dick Hare loved me above anything on earth. And he does still, or he'd never had said what he did in open court. It's better to be born lucky than rich. Won't West Lynne envy me? Mrs. Richard Hare of the Grove! Old Hare is on his last legs, and then Dick comes into his own. Mrs. Hare must have her future house elsewhere, for we shall want the Grove for ourselves. I wonder if Madame Barbara will condescend to recognize me. And that blessed Corney! I shall be a sort of cousin of Corney's then. I wonder how much Dick comes into, 3,000 or 4,000 a year? And to think that I had nearly escaped this by tying myself to that ape of a Jiffin! What sharks do get into our unsuspecting paths! On went Afy through West Lynne till she arrived close to Mr. Justice Hare's. Then she paced slowly. It had been a frequent walk of hers since the trial. Luck favoured her to-day. As she was passing the gate, young Richard Hare came up from the direction of East Lynne. It was the first time Afy had obtained speech of him. "Good day, Richard. Why, you were never going to pass an old friend." "I have so many friends," said Richard, "I can scarcely spare time for them individually. You might for me. Have you forgotten old days?" continued she, bridling and flirting, and altogether showing herself off to advantage. "No, I have not," replied Richard, "and I am hardly likely to do so," he pointedly added. "Ah, I felt sure of that. My heart told me so. When you went off that dreadful night, leaving me to anguish and suspense, I thought I should die. I never have had, so to say, a happy moment till this, when I meet you again." "Don't be a fool, Afy," was Richard's gallant rejoinder, borrowing the favourite reproach of Miss Carlyle. "I was young and green once. You won't suppose I have remained so. We will drop the past, if you please. How is Mr. Jiffin?" "Oh, the wretch!" shrieked Afy. "Is it possible that you can have fallen into the popular scandal that I have anything to say to him? You know I'd never demean myself to it. That's West Lynne all over. Nothing but inventions in it from week's end to week's end. A man who sells cheese, who cuts up bacon. Well, I'm surprised at you, Mr. Richard." "I have been thinking what luck you were in to get him," said Richard, with composure. "But it is your business, not mine." "Could you bear to see me stoop to him?" returned Afy, dropping her voice to the most unsuitable whisper. "Look you, Afy, what ridiculous folly you are nursing in your head, I won't trouble myself to guess. But the sooner you get it out again, the better. I was an idiot once, I don't deny it, but you cured me of that, and cured me with a vengeance. You must pardon me for intimating that from henceforth we are strangers, in the street as elsewhere. I have resumed my own standing again, which I perilled when I ran after you." Afy turned faint. "How could you speak those cruel words?" gasped she. "You called them forth. I was told yesterday that Afy Hallijohn, dressed up to a caricature, was looking after me again. It won't do, Afy." "Oh!" sobbed Afy, growing hysterical. "And is this to be all my recompense for years I have spent pining after you, keeping single for your sake?" "Recompense? Oh, if you want that, I'll get my mother to give Jiffin her custom." And with a ringing laugh, which, though it had nothing of malice in it, showed Afy that he took her approach for all it was worth, Richard turned in at his own gate. It was a deathly blow to Afy's vanity, the worst it had ever received, and she took a few minutes to compose herself and smooth her ruffled feathers. Then she turned and sailed back towards Mr. Jiffin's, her turban up in the skies, the plume de coq tilting to the admiration of all beholders, especially of Miss Carlyle, who had the gratification of surveying her through her window. Arrived at Mr. Jiffin's, she was taken ill exactly opposite his door, and staggered into the shop in a most exhausted state. Round the counter flew Mr. Jiffin, leaving the shopman staring behind it. What was the matter? What could he do for her? "Faint, heat of the sun, walked too fast, allowed to sit down for 5 minutes," gasped Afy, in disjointed sentences. Mr. Jiffin tenderly conducted her through the shop to his parlour. Afy cast half an eye round, saw how comfortable were its arrangements, and her symptoms of faintness increased. Gasps and hysterical sobs came forth together. Mr. Jiffin was as one upon spikes. She'd recover better there than in the public shop. If she'd only excuse his bringing her in, and consent to stay for a few minutes, no harm could come to her, and West Lynne could never say it. He'd stand at the far end of the room, right away from her. He'd prop open the 2 doors and the windows. He'd call in the maid, anything she thought right. should he get her a glass of wine? Afy declined the wine by a gesture, and sat fanning herself, Mr. Jiffin looking on from a respectful distance. Gradually she grew composed, grew herself again. As she gained courage, Mr. Jiffin lost it, and he ventured upon some faint words of reproach of him. Afy burst into a laugh. "Did I not do it well?" she exclaimed. "I thought I'd play off a joke upon you, so I came up this afternoon and did it." Mr. Jiffin clasped his hands. "Was it a joke?" he returned, trembling with agitation, uncertain whether he was in paradise or not. "Are you still ready to let me call you mine?" "Of course it was a joke," said Afy. "What a soft you must have been, Mr. Jiffin, not to see through it. When young ladies engage themselves to be married, you can't suppose they run back on it, so close to the wedding day." "Oh, Miss Afy!" And the poor little man actually burst into delicious tears as he caught hold of Afy's hand and kissed it. "A great green donkey," thought Afy to herself, bending on him, however, the sweetest smile. Rather, but Mr. Jiffin is not the only great donkey in the world. Richard Hare, meanwhile, had entered his mother's presence. She was sitting at the window, the justice opposite her, in an invalid chair, basking in the air and the sun. This last attack of the justice had affected more the mind than the body. He was brought down to the sitting-room that day for the first time, but of his mind there was little hope. It was in a state of half-imbecility, the most wonderful characteristic being that all its self-will, its surliness, had gone. Almost as a little child intractability was Justice Hare. Richard came up to his mother and kissed her. He had been to East Lynne. Mrs. Hare took his hand and fondly held it. The change in her was wonderful. She was a young and happy woman again. "Barbara has decided to go to the seaside, mother. Mr. Carlyle takes her on Monday." "I am glad, my dear. It will be sure to go her good." Richard, bending over her husband, but retaining her son's hand, "Barbara is going to the seaside. I will set her up." "Aye, aye," nodded the justice. "Set her up. Seaside. Can't we go?" "Certainly, dear, if you wish. When you shall be a little stronger." "Aye, aye," nodded the justice. It was his usual answer now. "Stronger. Where's Barbara?" "She goes on the Monday, sir," said Richard, likewise bending his head. "Only for a fortnight. But they are talking of going again later in the autumn." "Can't I go too?" repeated the justice, looking pleadingly into Richard's face. "You shall, dear father. Who knows but a month or two's bracing will bring you round again? We might go all together, ourselves and the Carlyles. Anne's coming to stay with us next week, you know, and we might go when her visit is over." "Aye, all go together. Anne's coming." "Have you forgotten, dear Richard? She comes to stay for a month with us, and Mr. Clitheroe and the children. I am so pleased she will find you better," added Mrs. Hare, her gentle eyes filling. "Mr. Wainwright says you may go out for a drive to-morrow." "And I'll be coachman," laughed Richard. "It will be the old times come round again. Do you remember, father, my breaking the pole one moonlight night, and your not letting me drive for 6 months afterwards?" The poor justice laughed in answer to Richard, laughed till the tears ran down his face, probably not knowing in the least what he was laughing at. "Richard," said Mrs. Hare to her son, almost in an apprehensive tone, her hand pressing his nervously, "was not that Afy Hallijohn I saw you speaking with at the gate?" Did you? What a spectacle she made of herself! I wonder she is not ashamed to go through the streets in such a guise. Indeed, I wonder she shows herself at all. Richard, you will not be drawn in again, were the next whispered words. Mother? There was a sternness in his mild blue eyes as he cast them upon his mother. Those beautiful eyes, the very counterpart of Barbara's, both his and hers, the counterpart of Mrs. Hare's. The look had been sufficient refutation without words. Mother mine, I am going to belong to you in the future, and to nobody else. West Lynne is already busy for me. I understand, pleasantly, carving out my destiny. One marvels whether I shall lose myself with Miss Afy. Another, that I shall set on off-hand and court Louisa Dobbin. They are all wrong. My place will be with my darling mother, at least for several years to come. She clasped his hand to her bosom in her glad delight. We want happiness together, mother, to enable us to forget the past, for upon none did the blow fall as upon you and upon me, and the happiness we shall find in our own home, living for each other, and striving to amuse my poor father. Ay, ay, complacently put in Justice Hare. So it would be. Richard had returned to his home, had become, to all intent and purposes, its master, for the justice would never be in a state to hold sway again. He had resumed his position, and regained favour of West Lynne, which, always in extremes, was now wanting to kill him with kindness. A happy, happy home from henceforth, and Mrs. Hare lifted up her full heart in thankfulness to God. Perhaps Richard's went up also. One word touching the wretched prisoner in the condemned cell at Lynneborough. As you must have anticipated, the extreme sentence was not carried out, and, little favourite as Sir Francis is with you and with me, we can but admit that justice did not demand that it should be. That he had wilfully killed Hallijohn was certain, but the act was committed in a moment of wild rage. It had not been premeditated. The sentence was commuted to transportation, a far more disgraceful one in the estimation of Sir Francis, a far more unwelcome one in the eyes of his wife. It is no use mincing the truth. One little grain of comfort had penetrated to Lady Levison, the anticipation of the time when she and her ill-fated child should be alone, and could hide themselves in some hidden nook of the wide world. He and his crime, and his end gone, forgotten. But it seems he was not to go and be forgotten. She and the boy must be tied to him still, and she was lost in horror and rebellion. He envied the dead Hallijohn, did that man, as he looked forth on the future. A cheering prospect, truly. The gay Sir Francis Levison working in chains with his gang. Where would his diamonds, his perfumed handkerchiefs, and his white hands be then? After a time he might get a ticket of leave. He groaned in agony as the turnkey suggested it to him. A ticket of leave for him? Oh, why did they not hang him? He wailed forth, as he closed his eyes to the dim light. The light of the cell, you understand, he could not close them to the light of the future. No, never again. It shone out all too plainly, dazzling his brain, as with a flame of living fire.
End of chapter 45.
Chapter 46 of East Lynne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Caron. East Lynne by Mrs. Henry Wood. Chapter 46. Until Eternity. Barbara was at the seaside, and Lady Isabel was in her bed, dying. You remember the old French saying, L'homme propose et Dieu dispose. An exemplification of it was here. She, Lady Isabel, had consented to remain at East Lynne during Mrs. Carlyle's absence, on purpose that she might be with her children, but the object was frustrated, for Lucy and Archibald had been removed to Mrs. Carlyle's. It was Mr. Carlyle's arrangement. He thought the governess ought to have the entire respite from all charge, and that poor governess dared not say, "Let him stay with me." Lady Isabel had also purposed to be safely away from East Lynne before the time came for her to die, but that time had advanced with giant strides, and the period for removal was past. She was going out as her mother had done, rapidly, unexpectedly, like the snuff of a candle. Wilson was in attendance on her mistress. Joyce remained at home. Barbara had chosen a watering place near, not 30 miles off, so that Mr. Carlyle went there most evenings, returning to his office in the mornings. Thus he saw little of East Lynne, paying 1 or 2 flying visits only, from the Saturday to the Wednesday in the second week. He did not come home at all, and it was in those few days that Lady Isabel had changed for the worse. On the Wednesday he was expected home to dinner and to sleep. Joyce was in a state of frenzy, or next door to it. Lady Isabel was dying, and what would become of the ominous secret, a conviction born of her fears, was on the girl's mind that, with death, the whole must become known, and who was to foresee what blame might not be cast upon her by her master and mistress, for not having disclosed it? She might be accused of having been an abettor in the plot from the first. 50 times it was in Joyce's mind to send for Miss Carlyle and tell her all. The afternoon was fast waning, and the spirit of Lady Isabel seemed to be waning with it. Joyce was in the room, in attendance upon her. She had been in a fainting state all day, but felt better now. She was partially raised in bed by pillows, a white cashmere shawl over her shoulders, her nightcap off, to allow as much air as possible to come to her, and the windows stood open. Footsteps sounded on the gravel in the quiet stillness of the summer air. They penetrated even to her ear, for all her faculties were keen yet. Beloved footsteps, and a tinge of hectic rose to her cheeks. Joyce, who stood at the window, glanced out. It was Mr. Carlyle. "Joyce!" came forth a cry from the bed, sharp and eager. Joyce turned round. "My lady? I should die happily if I might see him." "See him!" uttered Joyce, doubting her own ears. "My lady, see him, Mr. Carlyle? What can it signify? I am already as one dead. Should I ask it or wish it? Think you, in rude life? The yearning has been upon me for days, Joyce. It is keeping death away." "It could not be, my lady," was the decisive answer. "It must not be. It is as a thing impossible." Lady Isabel burst into tears. "I can't die for the trouble," she wailed. "You keep my children from me. They must not come, you say, lest I should betray myself. Now you would keep my husband. Joyce, Joyce, let me see him." Her husband, poor thing! Joyce was in a maze of distress, though not the less firm. Her eyes were wet with tears, but she believed she should be infringing her allegiance to her mistress. Did she bring Mr. Carlyle to the presence of his former wife? Altogether it might be productive of nothing but confusion. A knock at the chamber door. Joyce called out, "Come in." The 2 maids, Hannah and Sarah, were alone in the habit of coming to the room, and neither of them had ever known Madame Vine as Lady Isabel. Sarah put in her head. "Master wants you, Miss Joyce." "I'll come. He is in the dining room. I have just taken down Master Arthur to him." Mr. Carlyle had got Master Arthur on his shoulder. When Joyce entered, Master Arthur was decidedly given to noise and rebellion, and was already, as Wilson expressed it, sturdy upon his pins. "How is Madame Vine, Joyce?" Joyce scarcely knew how to answer, but she did not dare to equivocate as to her precarious state, and where the use, when a few hours would probably see the end of it. "She is very ill, indeed, sir." "Worse?" "Sir, I fear she is dying." Mr. Carlyle, in his consternation, put down Arthur. "Dying? I hardly think she will last till morning, sir." "Why, what has killed her?" he uttered in amazement. Joyce did not answer. He looked pale and confused. "Have you had Dr. Martin?" "Oh, no, sir, it would be of no use." "No use," repeated Mr. Carlyle in a sharp accent. "Is that the way to treat dying people?
Assume it is of no use to spend for advice, and so quietly let them die. If Madame Vine is as ill as you say, a telegraphic message must be sent off at once. I had better see her," he cried, moving to the door. Joyce, in her perplexity, dared to place her back against it, preventing his egress. "Oh, master, I beg your pardon, but it would not be right. Please, sir, do not think of going into her room." Mr. Carlyle thought Joyce was taken with a fit of prudery. "Why can't I go in?" he asked. "Mrs. Carlyle would not like it, sir," stammered Joyce, her cheeks scarlet now. Mr. Carlyle stared at her. "Some of you take up odd ideas," he cried. "In Mrs. Carlyle's absence, it is necessary that someone should see her. Let a lady die in my house, and never see after her. You are out of your senses, Joyce. I shall go in after dinner, so prepare Madame Vine." The dinner was being brought in then. Joyce, feeling like one in a nervous attack, picked up Arthur and carried him to Sarah in the nursery. What on earth was she to do? Scarcely had Mr. Carlyle begun his dinner, when his sister entered. Some grievance had arisen between her and the tenants of certain houses of hers, and she was bringing the dispute to him. Before he would hear it, he begged her to go up to Madame Vine, telling her what Joyce had said of her state. "Dying!" exclaimed Miss Corny, in disbelieving derision. "That Joyce has been more like a simpleton lately than like herself. I can't think what has come to the woman." She took off her bonnet and mantle and laid them on a chair, gave a twitch or two to her cap as she surveyed it in the pier glass, and went upstairs. Joyce answered her knock at the invalid's door, and Joyce, when she saw who it was, turned as white as any sheet. "Oh, ma'am, you must not come in," she blundered out, in her confusion and fear, as she put herself right in the doorway. "Who is to keep me out?" demanded Miss Carlyle, after a pause of surprise, her tone of quiet power. "Move away, girl. Joyce, I think your brain must be softening. What will you try at next?" Joyce was powerless, both in right and in strength, and she knew it. She knew there was no help, that Miss Carlyle would and must enter. She stood aside, shivering, and passed out of the room as soon as Miss Carlyle was within it. Ah, there could no longer be concealment now. There she was, her pale face lying against the pillow, free from its disgusting trappings, the band of gray velvet, the spectacles, the wraps for the throat and chin, the huge cap, all were gone. It was the face of Lady Isabel, changed certainly, very, very much, but still hers. The silvered hair fell on either side of her face, like the silky curls had once fallen. The sweet, sad eyes were the eyes of yore. "Mercy be good to us," uttered Miss Carlyle. They remained gazing at each other, both panting with emotion. Yes, even Miss Carlyle, though a wild suspicion had once crossed her brain that Madame Vine might be Lady Isabel, it had died away again from the sheer improbability of the thing, as much as from the convincing proofs offered by Lord Mount Severn. Not but what Miss Carlyle had borne in mind the suspicion, and had been fond of tracing the likeness in Madame Vine's face. "How could you dare come back here?" she abruptly asked, her tone of sad, soft wailing, not one of reproach. Lady Isabel humbly crossed her attended hands upon her chest. "My children," she whispered. "How could I stay away from them? Have pity, Miss Carlyle. Don't reproach me. I am on my way to God, to answer for all my sins and sorrows." "I do not reproach you," said Miss Carlyle. "I am so glad to go," she continued to murmur, her eyes full of tears. "Jesus did not come, you know, to save the good like you. He came for the sake of us poor sinners. I tried to take up my cross as he bade us, and bear it bravely for his sake, but its weight has killed me. The good like you, humbly, meekly, deferentially, was it expressed, in all good faith and trust, as though Miss Corny was a sort of upper angel. Somehow the words grated on Miss Corny's ear, grated fiercely on her conscience. It came into her mind, then, as she stood there, that the harsh religion that she had through life professed was not the religion that would best bring peace to her dying bed. "Child," said she, drawing near to and leaning over Lady Isabel, "had I anything to do with sending you from East Lynne?" Lady Isabel shook her head and cast down her gaze as she whispered, "You did not send me. You did not help to send me. I was not very happy with you. But that was not the cause of my going away. Forgive me, Miss Carlyle, forgive me."
Thank God! Inwardly breathed Miss Carlyle. Forgive me, she said, aloud and in agitation, touching her hand. I could have made your home happier, and I wish I had done it. I have wished it ever since you left it. Lady Isabel drew the hand in hers. I want to see Archibald, she whispered, going back in thought to the old time and the old name. I have prayed Joyce to bring him to me, and she will not. Only for a minute, just to hear him say that he forgives me. What can it matter now that I am as one lost to the world? I should die easier. Upon what impulse or grounds Miss Carlyle saw fit to accede to the request cannot be told. Probably she did not choose to refuse a deathbed prayer. Possibly, she reasoned, as did Lady Isabel. What could it matter? She went to the door. Joyce was in the corridor, leaning against the wall, her apron up to her eyes. Miss Carlyle beckoned to her. How long have you known of this? Since that night in the spring, when there was an alarm of fire. I saw her then, with nothing on her face, and knew her, though at the first moment I thought it was her ghost. Ma'am, I have just gone about since, like a ghost myself from fear. Go and request your master to come up to me. Oh, ma'am, will it be well to tell him? Remonstrated Joyce. Well, that he should see her? Go and request your master to come to me, unequivocally repeated Miss Carlyle. Are you mistress, Joyce, or am I? Joyce went down and brought Mr. Carlyle up from the dinner table. Is Madame Vine worse, Cornelia? Will she see me? She wishes to see you. Miss Carlyle opened the door as she spoke. He motioned her to pass in first. No, she said. You had better see her alone. He was going in when Joyce caught his arm. Master, master, you ought to be prepared. Ma'am, won't you tell him? He looked at them, thinking they must be moonstruck, for their conduct seemed inexplicable. Both were evident agitation, an emotion Miss Carlyle was not given to. Her face and lips were twitching, but she kept a studied silence. Mr. Carlyle knit his brow and went into the chamber. They shut him in. He walked gently at once to the bed, in his straightforward manner. I am grieved, Madame Vine. The words faltered on his tongue. He was a man as little given to show emotion as man can well be. Did he think, as Joyce had once done, that it was a ghost he saw? Certain it is that his face and lips turned the hue of death, and he backed a few steps from the bed. The falling hair, the sweet mournful eyes, the hectic which his presence brought to her cheeks, told too plainly of the Lady Isabel. Archibald! She put out her trembling hand. She caught him ere he had drawn quite beyond her reach. He looked at her. He looked around the room, as does one awaking from a dream. I could not die without your forgiveness, she murmured, her eyes falling before him as she thought of her past. Do you turn from me? Bear with me a little minute. Only say you forgive me, and I shall die in peace. Isabel, he spoke, not knowing in the least what he said. Were you Madame Vine? Oh, forgive me. I did not die. I got well from the accident, but it changed me dreadfully. Nobody knew me, and I came here as Madame Vine. I could not stay away, Archibald. Forgive me. His mind was in a whirl. His ideas had gone wool-gathering. The first clear thought that came thumping through his brain was that he must be a man of two wives. She noticed his perplexed silence. I could not stay away from you and my children. The longing for you was killing me, she reiterated wildly, like one talking in a fever. I never knew a moment's peace after the mad act I was guilty of in quitting you. Not an hour had I departed when my repentance set in, and even then I would have retraced and come back, but I did not know how. See what it has done for me, tossing up her gray hair, holding out her attenuated wrists. Oh, forgive me, my sin was great, but my punishment was greater. It has been as one long scene of mortal agony. Why did you go? Asked Mr. Carlyle. Did you not know? No, it has always been a mystery to me. I went out of love for you. A shade of disdain crossed his lips. She was equivocating to him on her deathbed. Do not look in that way, she panted. My strength is nearly gone. You must perceive that it is, and I do not, perhaps, express myself clearly.
I loved you dearly, and I grew suspicious of you. I thought you were false and deceitful to me, that your love was all given to another, and in my sore jealousy I listened to the temptings of that bad man, who whispered to me of revenge. It was not so, was it?" Mr. Carlyle had regained his calmness, outwardly at any rate. He stood by the side of the bed, looking down upon her, his arms crossed upon his chest, and his noble form raised to its full height. "Was it so?" she feverishly repeated. "Can you ask it, knowing me as you did then, as you must have known me since? I never was false to you in thought, in word, or in deed." "Oh, Archibald, I was mad. I was mad. I could not have done it in anything but madness. Surely you will forget and forgive." "I cannot forget. I have already forgiven." "Try and forget the dreadful time that has passed since that night," she continued, the tears falling on her cheeks, as she held up to him one of her poor hot hands. "Let your thoughts go back to the days when you first knew me, when I was here. Isabel Vane, a happy girl with my father. At times I have lost myself in a moment's happiness in thinking of it. Do you remember how you grew to love me, though you thought you might not tell it to me, and how gentle you were with me? When Papa died, and the £100 note, do you remember coming to the Castle Marling, and my promise to be your wife, and the first kiss you left upon my lips? And oh, Archibald, do you remember the loving days after I was your wife? How happy we were with each other. Do you remember when Lucy was born? We thought I should have died, and your joy, your thankfulness that God restored me. Do you remember all this?" Aye, he did remember it. He took the poor hand into his, and unconsciously played with its wasted fingers. "Have you any reproach to cast to me?" he gently said, bending his head a little. "Reproach to you who must be almost without reproach in the sight of heaven. You who were everlasting to me, ever anxious for my welfare. When I think of what you were and are, and how I quitted you, I could sink into the earth with remorse and shame. My own sin, I cannot expiate the shame I entailed upon you and upon our children." Never he felt it as keenly now as he had felt it then. "Think that it has been for me," she resumed, and he was obliged to bend his ear to catch her gradually weakening tones. "To live in this house with your wife, to see your love for her, to watch the envied caresses that once were mine. I never loved you so passionately as I have done since I lost you. Think what it was to watch William's decaying strength, to be alone with him in his dying hour, and not to be able to say he is my child, as well as yours, when he lay dead, and the news went forth to the household. It was her pretty grief you soothed, not mine, his mother's. God alone knows how I have lived through it all. It has been to me as the bitterness of death." "Why did you come back?" was the response of Mr. Carlyle. "I have told you I could not live, wanting you and my children. It was wrong in all ways, wickedly wrong. You cannot think worse of it than I have done, but the consequences and the punishment would be mine alone, as long as I guarded against discovery. I never thought to stop here to die, but death seems to have come on me with a leap, like it came to my mother." A pause of labored hard breathing. Mr. Carlyle did not interrupt it. All wrong," she resumed. "This interview with you, among the rest, and yet I hardly know. It cannot hurt the new ties you have formed, for I am as one dead now to this world, hovering on the brink of the next. But you were my husband, Archibald, and the last few days I have longed for your forgiveness with a fevered longing. Oh, that the past could be blotted out, that I could wake up and find it but a hideous dream, that I were here as in old days, in health and happiness, your ever-loving wife. Do you wish it, that the dark past had never had place?" She put the question in a sharp, eager tone, gazing up to him with an anxious gaze, as though the answer might be one of life or death. "For your sake I wish it." Calm enough were the words spoken, and her eyes fell again, and a deep sigh came forth. "I am going to William, but Lucy and Archibald will be left. Oh, do you never be unkind to them, I pray you. Visit not their mother's sin upon their heads. Do not in your love for your later children lose your love for them. Have you seen anything in my conduct that could give rise to fears of this. He returned, reproach mingled in his sad tone. The children are dear to me, as you once were, as I once was, ay, and as I might have been now. Indeed you might, he answered with emotion. The fault was not mine, Archibald. I am on the very threshold of the next world. Will you not bless me? Will you not say a word of love to me before I pass it? Let what I am, I say, be blotted for the moment from your memory. Think of me, if you can, as the innocent, timid child whom you made your wife. Only a word of love. My heart is breaking for it. He leaned over her. He pushed aside the hair from her brow with his gentle hand, his tears dropping on her face. You nearly broke mine when you left me, Isabel, he whispered. May God bless you, and take you to his rest in heaven. May he so deal with me, as I now fully and freely forgive you. What was he about to do? Lower and lower bent his head, until his breath nearly mingled with hers. To kiss her? He best knew, but suddenly his face grew red with a scarlet flush, and he lifted it again. Did the form of one then in a felon's cell at Lynneborough thrust itself before him, or that of his absent and unconscious wife? To his rest in heaven, she murmured, in the hollow tones of the departing. Yes, yes, I know that God had forgiven me. Oh, what a struggle it has been! Nothing but bad feelings, rebellion, and sorrow, and repining for a long while after I came back here. But Jesus prayed for me, and helped me, and you know how merciful he is to the weary and heavy laden. We shall meet again, Archibald, and live together forever and ever. But for that great hope I could hardly die. William said mamma would be on the banks of the river, looking out for him. But it is William who is looking for me. Mr. Carlyle released one of his hands. She had taken them both, and with his own white handkerchief wiped the death dew from her forehead. It is no sin to anticipate it, Archibald, for there will be no marrying or giving in marriage in heaven. Christ said so, though we do not know how it will be. My sin will be remembered no more there, and we shall be together with our children forever and forever. Keep a little corner in your heart for your poor lost Isabel. Yes, yes, he whispered. Are you leaving me? She uttered, in a wild tone of pain. Are you growing faint, I perceive? I must call assistance. Farewell, then, farewell. Until eternity, she sighed, the tears raining from her eyes. It is death, I think not faintness. Oh, but it is hard to part. Farewell, farewell, my once dear husband. She raised her head from the pillow, excitement giving her strength. She clung to his arm. She lifted her face in its sad yearning. Mr. Carlyle laid her tenderly down again, and suffered his wet cheek to rest upon hers. Until eternity, she followed him with her eyes as he retreated, and watched him from the room, then turned her face to the wall. It is over, only God now. Mr. Carlyle took an instant's counsel with himself, stopping at the head of the stairs to do it. Joyce, in obedience to a sign from him, had already gone into the sick chamber. His sister was standing at the door. Cornelia, she followed him down to the dining room. You will remain here tonight with her? Do you suppose I shouldn't? Crossly responded Miss Corny. Where are you off to now? To the telegraph office at present, to send for Lord Mount Severn. What good can he do? None. But I shall send for him. Can't one of the servants go just as well as you? You have not finished your dinner, hardly begun it. He turned his eyes on the dinner table in a mechanical sort of way. His mind wholly preoccupied, made some remark in answer, which Miss Corny did not catch, and went out. On his return, his sister met him in the hall, drew him inside the nearest room, and closed the door. Lady Isabel was dead, has been dead about 10 minutes. She never spoke after you left her, Archibald. There was a slight struggle at the last, a fighting for breath. Otherwise, she went off quite peacefully. I felt sure, when I first saw her this afternoon, that she could not last till midnight. End of chapter 46. Recording by Chris Caron. Ham Lake, Minnesota.
Chapter 60 of East Lynne. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. East Lynne by Mrs. Henry Wood. Chapter 60. I.M.V. Lord Mount Severn, wondering greatly what the urgent summons could be for, lost no time in obeying it, and was at East Lynne the following morning early. Mr. Carlyle had his carriage at the station, his close carriage, and shut up in that he made the communication to the Earl as they drove to East Lynne. The Earl could with difficulty believe it. Never had he been so utterly astonished. At first he really could not understand the tale. Did she come back to your house to die?" he blundered. "You never took her in. I don't understand." Mr. Carlyle explained further, and the Earl at length understood. But he did not recover his perplexed astonishment. "What a mad act to come back here! Madame Vine! How on earth did she escape detection?" "She did escape it," said Mr. Carlyle. "The strange likeness Madame Vine possessed to my first wife did often strike me as being marvellous, but I never suspected the truth. It was a likeness, and not a likeness, for every part of her face and form was changed except her eyes, and those I never saw but through those disguising glasses." The Earl wiped his hot face. The news had ruffled him no measured degree. He felt angry with Isabel, dead though she was, and thankful that Mrs. Carlyle was away. "Will you see her?" whispered Mr. Carlyle as they entered the house. "Yes." They went up to the death chamber, Mr. Carlyle procuring the key. It was the only time that he entered it. Very peaceful she looked now, her pale features so composed under her white cap and hands. Miss Carlyle and Joyce had done all that was necessary; nobody else had been suffered to approach her. Lord Mount Severn leaned over her, tracing the former looks of Isabel, and the likeness grew upon him in a wonderful degree. "What did she die of?" he asked. "She said a broken heart." "Ah," said the Earl, "the wonder is that it did not break before. Poor thing! Poor Isabel," he added, touching her hand. "How she marred her own happiness! Carlyle, I suppose this is your wedding ring?" Mr. Carlyle cast his eyes upon the ring. "Very probably." "To think of her never having discarded it!" remarked the Earl, releasing the cold hand. "Well, I can hardly believe the tale now." He turned and quitted the room as he spoke. Mr. Carlyle looked steadfastly at the dead face for a minute or two, his fingers touching the forehead, but what his thoughts or feelings may have been none can tell. Then he replaced the sheet over her face, and followed the Earl. They descended in silence to the breakfast room. Miss Carlyle was seated at the table waiting for them. "Where could all your eyes have been?" exclaimed the Earl to her, after a few sentences, referring to the event just past. "Just where yours would have been," replied Miss Corny, with a touch of her old temper. "You saw Madame Vine as well as we did." "But not continuously, only 2 or 3 times in all, and I do not remember ever to have seen her without her bonnet and veil. That Carlyle should not have recognised her is almost beyond belief." "It seems so to speak of it," said Miss Corny, "but facts are facts. She was young and gay, active, when she left here, upright as a dart, her dark hair drawn from her open brow, and flowing on her neck, her cheeks like crimson paint, her face altogether beautiful. Madame Vine arrived here, a pale, stooping woman, lame of leg, shorter than Lady Isabel, and her figure stuffed out under those sacks of jackets. Not a bit scarcely of her forehead to be seen, for grey velvet and grey bands of hair, her head smothered under a close cap, large, blue, double spectacles hiding the eyes and their sides, and the throat tied up, the chin partially. The mouth was entirely altered in its character, and that upward scar, always so conspicuous, made it almost ugly. Then she had lost some of her front teeth, you know, and she lisped when she spoke. Take her for all in all, summed up Miss Carlyle. She looked no more like Isabel, who went away from here, than I look like Adam. Just get your dearest friend damaged and disguised as she was, my lord, and see if you'd recognise him." The observation came home to Lord Mount Severn. A gentleman whom he knew well, had been so altered by a fearful accident, that little resemblance could be traced to his former self. In fact, his own family could not recognise him, and he used an artificial disguise. It was a case in point, and, reader, I assure you it was a true one. "It was certainly the disguise that we ought to have suspected," quietly observed Mr. Carlyle. "The likeness was not sufficiently striking to cause suspicion." "But she turned the house from that scent as soon as she came into it," struck in Miss Corny, telling of the neuralgic pains that affected her head and face, rendering the guarding them from exposure necessary. "Remember, Lord Mount Severn, that the Ducies had been with her in Germany, and had never suspected her. remember also another thing, that however great a likeness we may have detected, we could not and did not speak of it one to another. Lady Isabel's name is never so much as whispered among us." "True, all true," nodded the Earl, and they sat themselves down to breakfast. On the Friday, the following letter was dispatched to Mrs. Carlyle. "My dearest, I find I shall not be able to get to you on Saturday afternoon as I promised, but will leave by the late train that night. Mind you don't sit up for me. Lord Mount Severn is here for a few days. He sends his regards to you. And now, Barbara, prepare for news that will prove a shock. Madame Vine is dead. She grew rapidly worse, they tell me, after our departure, and died on Wednesday night. I am glad you were away. Love from the children. Lucy and Archie are still at Cornelia's, Arthur wearing out Sarah's legs in the nursery. Ever yours, my dearest, Archibald Carlyle." Of course Madame Vine, the governess, died at Mr. Carlyle's house. He could not, in courtesy, do less than follow her to the grave. So decided West Lynne, when they found which way the wind was going to blow. Lord Mount Severn followed also, to keep him company, being on a visit to him, and very polite indeed of his lordship to do it, condescending also. West Lynne remembered another funeral at which those two had been the only mourners, that of the Earl. By some curious coincidence the French governess was buried close to the Earl's grave. "As good there as anywhere else," quoth West Lynne. There happened to be a vacant spot of ground. The funeral took place on a Sunday morning. A plain, respectable funeral. A hearse and pair, and mourning coach and pair, with a chariot for the Reverend Mr. Little. No pallbearers or mutes, or anything of that show-off kind, and no plumes on the horses, only on the hearse. West Lynne looked on with approbation, and conjectured that the governess had left sufficient money to bury herself, but of course that was Mr. Carlyle's affair, not West Lynne's. Quiet enough she lay in her last resting-place. They left her in it, the Earl and Mr. Carlyle, and entered the mourning coach, to be conveyed back again to East Lynne. "Just a little stone of white marble, 2 feet high by a foot and a half broad," remarked the Earl, on their road, pursuing a topic they were speaking upon, "with the initials I.V. and the date of the year. Nothing more. What do you think?" "I.M.V.," corrected Mr. Carlyle. "Yes." At this moment the bells of another church, not St. Jude's, broke out in a joyous peal, and the Earl inclined his ear to listen. "What can they be ringing for?" he cried. They were ringing for a wedding. Afy Hallijohn, by the help of 2 clergymen and 6 bridesmaids, of which you may be sure Joyce was not one, had just been converted into Mrs. Joe Jiffin. When Afy took a thing into her head, she somehow contrived to carry it through, and to bend even clergymen and bridesmaids to her will. Mr. Jiffin was blessed at last. In the afternoon the Earl left East Lynne, and somewhat later Barbara arrived at it. Wilson scarcely gave her mistress time to step into the house before her, and she very nearly left the baby in the fly. Curiously anxious was Wilson to hear all the particulars as to whatever could have took off that French governess. Mr. Carlyle was much surprised at their arrival. "How could I stay away, Archibald, even until Monday, after the news you sent me?" said Barbara. "What did she die of? It must have been awfully sudden." "I suppose so," was his dreamy answer. He was debating a question with himself, one he had thought over a good deal since Wednesday night. Should he, or should he not, tell his wife? He would have preferred not to tell her, and, were the secret confined to his own breast, he would decidedly not have done so. But it was known to 3 others, Miss Carlyle, Lord Mount Severn, and to Joyce. All trustworthy and of good intention, but it was impossible for Mr. Carlyle to make sure that not one of them would ever, through any chance and unpremeditated word, let the secret come to the knowledge of Mrs. Carlyle. That would not do. If she must hear it at all, she must hear it from him, and at once. He took his course. "Are you ill, Archibald?" she asked, noting his face. It wore a pale, worn sort of look. "I have something to tell you, Barbara," he answered, drawing her hand into his as they stood together. They were in her dressing-room, where she was taking off her things. "On the Wednesday evening, when I got home to dinner, Joyce told me that she feared Madame Vine was dying, and I thought it right to see her." "Certainly," returned Barbara, "quite right." "I went into her room, and found that she was dying. But I found something else, Barbara. She was not Madame Vine." "Not Madame Vine!" echoed Barbara, believing in good truth that her husband could not know what he was saying. "It was my former wife, Isabel Vane." Barbara's face flushed crimson, and then grew white as marble, and she drew her hand unconsciously from Mr. Carlyle's. He did not appear to notice the movement, but stood with his elbow on the mantelpiece while he talked, giving her a rapid summary of the interview and its details. She could not stay away from her children, she said, and came back as Madame Vine. What with the effects of the railroad accident in France, and those spectacles she wore, and her style of dress, and her grey hair, she felt secure in not being recognised. I am astonished now that she was not discovered. Were such a thing related to me, I should give no credence to it. Barbara's heart felt faint with its utter sickness, and she turned her face from the view of her husband. Her first confused thoughts were as Mr. Carlyle's had been, that she had been living in his house with another wife. "Did you suspect her?" she breathed in a low tone. "Barbara! Had I suspected it, should I have allowed it to go on? She implored my forgiveness for the past, and for having returned here, and I gave it to her fully. I then went to East Lynne to telegraph to Mount Severn, and when I came back she was dead." There was a pause. Mr. Carlyle began to perceive that his wife's face was hidden from him. "She said her heart was broken. Barbara, we cannot wonder at it." There was no reply. Mr. Carlyle took his arm from the mantelpiece, and moved so that he could see her countenance, a wan countenance, telling of pain. He laid his hand upon her shoulder, and made her look at him. "My dearest, what is this?" "Oh, Archibald!" she uttered, clasping her hands together, all her pent-up feelings bursting forth, and the tears streaming from her eyes. "Has this taken your love from me?" He took both her hands in one of his. He put the other round her waist, and held her there, before him, never speaking, only looking gravely into her face. Who could look at its sincere truthfulness, at the sweet expression of his lips, and doubt him? Not Barbara. She allowed the moment's excitement to act upon her feelings and carry her away. "I had thought my wife possessed entire trust in me." "Oh, I do, I do. You know I do. Forgive me, Archibald," she slowly whispered. "I deemed it better to impart this to you, Barbara. Had there been wrong feeling on my part, I should have left you in ignorance. My darling, I have told it you in love." She was leaning on his breast, sobbing gently, her repentant face turned towards him. He held her there in his strong protection, his enduring tenderness. "My wife! My darling, now and always." "It was a foolish feeling to cross my heart, Archibald. It is done with and gone. Never let it come back, Barbara. Neither need her name be mentioned again between us. A barred name it has hitherto been, so let it continue." "Anything you will. My earnest wish is to please you, to be worthy of your esteem and love, Archibald," she timidly added, her eyelids drooping and her fair cheeks blushing as she made the confession. "There has been a feeling in my heart against your children, a sort of jealous feeling, you can understand, because they were hers, because she had once been your wife. I knew how wrong it was, and I have tried earnestly to subdue it. I have, indeed, and I think it is nearly gone." Her voice sunk. "I constantly pray to be helped to do it, to love them and care for them as if they were my own. It will come with time." "Every good thing will come with time that we may earnestly seek," said Mr. Carlyle. "Oh, Barbara, never forget that the only way to ensure peace in the end is to strive always to be doing right, unselfishly, under God." End of Chapter 60. End of East Lynne by Mrs. Henry Wood.